Day 4 is about taxonomy of organisms. So again, the link for the cheat sheet is attached to today's Google post. It's not really a cheat sheet per se, but it has a lot of information on it that you would need to help you answer questions, including the questions at the end of today's Pear Deck and on the exit ticket if you still need it by then. But we're going to review it to see how much you can get through without actually needing to use your cheat sheet. So what is taxonomy? Taxonomy is a neat and easy to use classification system for identifying and organizing all living organisms. So it helps create a hierarchy of relationships based on physical and genetic similarities. Think of it like one big family tree of life and organized levels of kind of like umbrellas or containers or buckets of larger buckets and smaller buckets that go inside of each other. So as we can see, inside of kingdom, you will have many phylums. Inside of phylums, you'll have many classes. Inside classes, you'll have many orders. Inside an order, you might have many families. Inside one family, you'll have many genuses. And inside of one genus, you can have multiple species. If you can notice that species doesn't have any breakdown for smaller things because species is as specific as we go, as by the name. So who created taxonomy? This dude named Carolus Linnaeus is known as the father of taxonomy. He also created a binomial nomenclature system, which is a two-part Latin scientific name that is given to every single organism. It helps keep us organized throughout all the continents where we study organisms, right? Because Latin is actually a dead language. Nobody speaks it anymore, but we can use it for scientific names of organisms. And that way, if you're communicating to somebody in Russia, for example, about an organism, they understand which organism you're talking about because the Latin name reference is always the same and always consistent. So like I said, it enhances the scientist's ability to communicate about discovered species without confusion, and it can help identify how closely related two organisms are, because if they share the same genus, they're already really, really closely related. And yeah, again, Carolus Linnaeus is the father of taxonomy, if that helps you remember. So type your answer. Why do we use the taxonomy classification system? Why is it useful? What is it helpful for? Take a pause and go ahead and do that. So taxonomy helps keep relationships between species and their ancestors all organized. Scientific communities all over the world use the same taxonomic system in order to make communications clear about species extinctions and discoveries. You don't have to write all of these in specifics, but I would like to have your answer be something along these lines, either to be about organizing species or to be about clear communication about species, because that's the main reason why we have an organization system in the first place. So how does taxonomy work? Well, organisms are going to be classified into groups of similarity based on their DNA, their structure, their behavior, or all of the above. The taxonomic system is still growing even to this day because we're constantly discovering new organisms, and we're also realizing that organisms are consistently going extinct, right? Technological advancements continue to improve our abilities to identify new organisms every day, or they help us identify the relationships between existing organisms. For example, when we observe DNA, because in the last decade, we have learned to be able to read DNA sequences. And that is super, super big because not only can you tell how much percentage organisms are related, you can also read the sequences to see if they exactly match up or if they only match up a little bit. Evolution also is obviously an ongoing process where species are going extinct or new species are forming as time goes. Like we just talked about in day 3, evolution is going to continually cause new things to pop up. So when new things pop up, we got to figure out what they're related to, where they came from, how we're going to categorize them. And that is what taxonomy is for. So how taxonomy works is, like I said before, the largest, very general categories will be like kingdom, and then it goes down to phylum, which is a little bit more specific. And then inside a phylum, you'll have a class, which is even more specific. Inside of a class, you have an order, which is even more specific. And then inside an order, you'll have a family, which is even more specific. And then inside of a family, you'll have a genus, which is even more specific. And then lastly, you'll have a species, which is the most specific that you can get. So this is the most exclusive club, basically. And the kingdom is pretty much containing, there's like 5 categories of all eukaryotic things, or not even eukaryotic, 5 categories of living things. And so they're very, very broad and very general. So if you've ever seen like the Russian Matryoshka dolls, that you can open one and another one pops out, open one and another one pops out, open that one and another one pops out. That's kind of how this taxonomic system really works, where you can open up the kingdom one and you have a phylum and a class and an order and a family and a genus and a species. And at the very end, that species is that tiny little doll at the very center that doesn't have anything else to break down into. And it's the most specific and contains the fewest number of organisms compared to that kingdom that you started out with. So here we have an example that we'll go through. Let me move myself over. So we have kind of the organization that shows you how we're going to go through the levels of taxonomy for this jaguar. And so the common name of this organism is a jaguar, and the scientific name is Panthera pardus. Notice that the scientific name is two Latin words, and it's italicized, so it's a slanty kind of font with the genus first and the species second. When you're typing out or ever writing a name, it's going to always be italicized if it's the Latin name, and only the genus or the first name is capitalized. That second name is never capitalized. So the first thing we're going to realize is that it's in the kingdom Animalia because it's an animal. Pretty straightforward, right? We all know this is an animal. So that's very, very broad though. If I just said it's in the kingdom Animalia and I didn't tell you what organism it was, you'd be like, well, you got any more details? And then I would say, okay, cool. So it's in the phylum Chordata. So it's an animal. So it's in the animal kingdom. But then also it's in Chordata. So it has a spinal cord. So now we're talking specifically about the animals that have spinal cords. And you're like, well, there's a lot of animals that have spinal cords too. Like we have spinal cords. And I'm like, you're right. Cool. So let's get even more specific now. It's in the class Mammalia, right? So it's an animal that has a spinal cord and it's warm-blooded. It gives birth to live babies and it feeds the babies milk from its mammary glands. So we're getting more specific now, right? And you're like, that's still not specific enough when you're describing something, right? I know it's an animal, it has a spinal cord, and it's warm-blooded. But again, there's still so many organisms that fall under that category, right? So we're gonna be like, cool, let's give you some more information. It's in the order Carnivora. So it eats meat. So it's a meat eater that's warm-blooded, has a spinal cord, and is an animal. And you're like, bro, that still is so vague. There's so many organisms that have those characteristics. And I'm like, cool. Let's get more specific then. So it's in the family Felidae, which means that it is a cat or a feline. And you're like, now we're working with something, right? We got pretty specific details now. When I said it was an animal, you were like, okay, and? But now that we're talking in the family, it's Felidae, you're like, okay, cool. So it's a cat that eats meat, that is warm-blooded, and it has a spinal cord as an animal. And you're like, okay, that's a lot of detail, but can we get more specific now? And the answer to that is yes. We're going to say the genus is Panthera, or it's a big cat, right? There are cats of all different kinds of sizes, but telling me it's part of the Panthera genus means that it's a larger cat, right? It's not your typical house cat. And then you're like, okay, cool. Let's just work it all the way down to the species now. And it's Panthera pardus, which means that this specific organism, this specific species is called Panthera pardus because that is the genus and species added together. Only jaguars have this specific name of Panthera pardus because it is specific to them, right? Species specific, species specific. One little note is that organisms that share more levels, starting from kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, the more of these levels that they share, the more closely they are related. And like I said, it doesn't mean you're cousins. It just means that your common ancestor might have been a couple thousands of years ago instead of like 8 billion years ago, you know? So it's a time frame reference of relativity. So I'm gonna have you work on these two examples now. So for these two examples, I'm gonna ask that you place the green star on the genus, right? There's two names. There's a name here, and then there's a name here, right? This is a timber wolf, and this one is a horse, right? Place the green star on the genus for these two names, and then place the purple heart on the species name for these two names. Go ahead and do that in your Pear Deck. How does taxonomy work? Well, the last part we want to know is that you can memorize this order of the naming system using a mnemonic device. So a mnemonic device would be something like a sentence that is represented by all of the letters that start each word of each taxonomy level. Okay. It's not self-explanatory until I give you an example. So we know that the levels of the taxonomy system are kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. But that's kind of hard to remember, so let's make a sentence out of it using other words that actually make sense in a sentence. The key word is, the key rule is that the letters have to begin with the same letters as kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, so that it can help you remember it, right? So the one I came up with is the K is going to be king, the P is going to be Philip, the C is going to be came, the O is going to be over, the F is for, G is great, and S is soup. So all together, the letters are still K, P, C, O, F, G, S, but it becomes a sentence that's easier to remember. For example, King Philip came over for great soup, right? That sentence actually makes sense in the English language, but it helps us remember that the order of the letters that come for the taxonomic organization is K, P, C, O, F, G, S, or kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I'm going to ask you to use your creativity now and create your own mnemonic device using words that begin with each of these letters. And you're going to put it like a little text box, or you can handwrite it if you have good handwriting. And this vertically should read as a sentence that begins with a word with the letter K. Second word should begin with the letter P. Third word should begin with the letter C. Fourth word should begin with the letter O. Fifth word begins with an F. Sixth word begins with a G, and then the seventh word should begin with an S. And so this should all be one sentence that actually makes sense. Okay, I'm gonna be grading you on your creativity and if it makes sense or not. Because some people, I guarantee you, are just gonna write gibberish and then they're not gonna get the point. So go ahead and rack your brains to create a mnemonic device that begins with these letters and actually makes sense as an English sentence. The next thing we're going to talk about is a diagram that's known as a cladogram. So this is a visual representation of the evolutionary relationships between animals or even an entire species. Okay, so if you're looking at this cladogram right here, we can tell that there's a bunch of these species that currently exist in current time. And that's why they're all in a line together here at the top. You'll notice that there's some characteristics that we're running through as the lines split up or stay together. And this is super important because these lines are characteristics that either you can tell an organism has or doesn't have. So we always start at the very, very base. And at the very base, we have this line that juts off that says hagfish. And this is a kind of aquatic fish-related organism. But you see that the node says jaw here at the bottom. When this disappears, it says jaws, right? So when you see that it says jaws, it means that if the hagfish branch off before the characteristic jaws, they existed before jaws became a thing, literally a thing that helps you chew, because hagfish actually don't have jaws. After we have the jaw, which is the thing that opens and closes your mouth, that characteristic now is applied to everything on this cladogram after its appearance. So jaws appears down here. So everything to the right side of it has jaws. The perch now branches off because the next characteristic we're looking at are lungs. And we know that fish do not have lungs. They have gills, right? So they branch off because they don't have lungs, but everything to the right side of the characteristic for lungs has lungs, right? So salamanders, lizards, pigeons, mice, and chimps all have lungs. Now we have the salamanders branching off because when the next characteristic is claws or nails, salamanders don't have either of those. They're squishy little beings, right? So after that, that means that lizards, pigeons, mice, and chimps all have either claws or nails. So there's some scratchy boys. And then lizards are going to branch off because right here we have a node that says feathers, right? That means these are pretty equally related to these because they branch off around the same point before any characteristics. But pigeons are special because they have feathers. So they're a little bit different from lizards. And then once you get fur and mammary glands, you can either get mice or get chimps. There's probably other characteristics that you could use here that separate these two, but they're pretty closely related because they have all of these characteristics that we just talked about, except for feathers, right? Only the pigeon here has the feathers, and that's why the node is marked here. So you can kind of tell what characteristics organisms have or don't have just by reading the cladogram and based on what developed and did they drop out before then or after. So again, like I said, these organisms all currently exist. That's why they're on a line at the top, because we're going from ages ago all the way up until now. This is just time's passage. And then each node is when a branch splits, signaling that because of evolution, organisms on the left do not have this characteristic or this trait, but the organisms to the right of this split do. So for example, here we have an amniotic egg, which means that the egg has fluid around it that protects the baby. And we know that amphibians and fish don't, but reptiles, birds, rodents, and primates all do have the liquid that helps protect the baby and cushion it when it's in the womb or developing in the egg. I want you to drag and drop now to tell me, as you read this cladogram, which organism is the least closely related to birds, crocodiles, rabbits, and primates. So we're talking about these four right here, right? They're all pretty closely related to each other. But which organism is the least closely related? Oh, sorry. So tell me in your Pear Deck, you're going to drag and drop that red spot onto the organism that is least closely related to these four, who are basically like cousins once removed, since they only have a couple characteristics different. Who is least related? Pause and go ahead and do that. So the next thing we're going to talk about is a dichotomous key. A dichotomous key is a diagram that lets us identify organisms based on their observable characteristics. So it's usually some kind of physical characteristic that we can see with our naked eye. And it uses a simple yes or no style of question. You either have it or you don't have it. And yes, you go this way. No, you go this way along the dichotomous key. For an example, if we were talking in general, you could think about in the category of animals, yes, it has red blood cells, or no, it has no red blood cells. If you say yes, you have categories of mammals, lizards, birds, fish. But if no, we're going to ask another question because there's still a lot of categories to choose from. If you don't have red blood, do you have a hard body or a soft body? If you have a hard body, right, it would be a question of yes or no. Yes, hard, or no. If you have a hard body or like an exoskeleton, you'd be an insect. And if you have a soft body, there's still a lot to choose from. So we're going to split that even more. So we're going to ask yes, shell, or no shell. If you have a soft body and no shell, you would be a jellyfish. And if you have a soft body and you have a shell, then you'd be shellfish, right? For example, like a clam. So these are ways of saying yes or no to each characteristic and kind of figuring out more and more specifically what we're going to end up with. So how do we use a dichotomous key? Well, you're always going to start at step one. It's like any recipe. You start at the very, very beginning. You're going to read the instructions under step one and then follow to the next step based on whether or not the specimen has or does not have that characteristic that mentions in step one. And then you're going to repeat every single one that you go through every time it tells you to go to another step. So you're going to read the step and see in the instructions whether you have it or you don't have it. Once you get to a name at the end of that step, instead of go to so-and-so, that means that's your answer. Okay, so we have this specimen here, and I'm going to ask you to start with step one at the top. So step one says, if the fish shape is long and skinny, go to step two. Or it says, if the fish shape is not long and skinny, go to step three. That means you're going to go to step two or step three based on the shape of this specimen. Okay, you're going to keep going and read through the A and B of each step, and then you're going to try and tell me what is the name. Type it in here using a text box, and then we're going to go over on the next slide. So if I go ahead and follow through, the actual answer to the dichotomous key for this organism right now is a spotted eagle ray. Let me show you how I got there. So in step one, it says, if the fish shape is long and skinny, go to step two. If the fish shape is not long and skinny, go to step three. Well, it doesn't look long and skinny to me, so I'm going to hop to step three. Here now the A and B options are, if the fish has both eyes on top of the head, go to step four. B says, if the fish has one eye on each side of its head, go to step five. Well, we're going to go to step 4 because both the eyes are on top of its head, because there's one here and there is one here, right? The only fish that we really know that have eyes on one side of its head are like flounder. So in step 4, if the fish has a long whip-like tail, it is a spotted eagle ray. Or if the fish has a short, blunt tail, it is a peacock flounder. Well, that tail looks pretty whippy to me, so it is a spotted eagle ray, and that is how you get your answer. Notice it doesn't say step anymore, so we're done, and that is the answer. It still had a step right here. We'd be following to another step and reading more instructions to keep going. So we're gonna do some guided practice now. We're using the rake method. So first things first, this is our question. This says, the relationships among different orders of millipedes are shown in the cladogram. Notice it said orders. So we're not talking about like a really specific category, because we're not talking about like genus or species, but we're talking about orders. So these are millipedes, or those little creepy crawlies that have a million legs. And based on this cladogram, which statement best describes relationships among millipede orders? Is the answer F? Stemulida is more closely related to Marocchida than Penicillata is to Marocchida. Okay, being able to read the names isn't super important as long as you can recognize them inside of the diagram. G says, is Spirostreptida is more closely related to Glomerida than Spirotherida is to Glomerida. So you're making comparisons here of how closely related different pairs of orders are. H says Polyzonida is more closely to Glomerodesmida than Spherotherida is to Glomerosdermida. And then J says Marocchida is more closely related to Glomerodesmida than Glomerida is to Glomerodesmida. Okay, reading these aloud sounds really, really complicated. And it does sound really complicated, but you're just matching the pairs at a time inside of the cladogram. Okay, so let's try to read and highlight the important parts of this question. So I would have highlighted cladogram here because we're talking about a cladogram, and this whole diagram right here is a cladogram. So that's going to be important to look at, obviously, if you want to get your answer. And we're looking at the best describes the relationship. So when we're making comparisons between these, you're going to want to talk about being more closely related. So which one is more closely related? Okay. And then these are the pairs you're comparing. So you're going to compare the reds to the red and then the blue to the blue. Okay. So when you're comparing them, make sure that you're looking at each pair correctly at a time. This is going to take time, yes, but you have plenty of time on your test to answer these. So be careful. This is literally going to be a freebie answer. Just because it looks complicated doesn't mean it actually is once you read it carefully. So what is the question asking? The question is asking about the relationships between the millipede orders in the cladogram. It's going to ask me to compare two relationships at a time to see which one is a more close relationship. So our knowledge is that the cladogram goes from left to right, which means that the millipedes that branched apart close to the right side are more closely related than the ones that branched apart close to the left side. So the branches over here means they branched a long time ago. And the branches over here means that they branched apart pretty recently. I will need to count how many splits exist between the pairs mentioned. So when I talk about a pair, I'm going to have to look at how many times did they split apart from each other, looking at these splits right here. So now we're going to eliminate and choose the best answer. The reason why F is the correct answer is because when you look at Stemulida and Marocchida, they're in the same branching right here. So they're really closely related. Penicillata right here and Marocchida are going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 branches away from each other. That's really far apart. They're really not related. Okay, but let's compare it to the other ones now. The other answer choice said Spirostreptida right here is more closely related to Glomerida. Glomerida is up here. So that means the split is 1, 2, 3, and then 4. So there are 4 splits apart. That's pretty far apart. Spherotherida and Glomerida is the next one we're talking about. And they're in the same little split right here. So they're only 1 apart. So this answer is incorrect because this first pair is actually less closely related than the second pair. So that would be wrong. Let's look at Polyzonida and Glomerosdesmida. Glomerosdesmida is right here, and Polyzonida is down here. So the split is 1, 2, and 3. So they got 3 apart. It's not too bad. Spherotherida is to glomerulodesmida. So glomerulodesmida is again up here, and spherotherida is right here. So they're actually in the same split. So when you compare the 3 split to the 1 split, man, it's not closely related again. It's less closely related. So that's why it's wrong again. And the last answer choice is going to be between Mariquita and glomerulodesmida. So Mariquita is right here, glomerulodesmida is here. So that's going to be 1, 2, 3, and 4 splits. Ooh, we're already comparing 4, so it's really far apart. And then glomerida to glomerulodesmida. So glomerida is over here, and glomerulodesmida is right here. So again, that's 1 split. So Mariquita is actually less closely related to glomerulodesmida because it's 4 compared to glomerida and glomerulodesmida because that's a 1. So basically, the only reason why F is right is because the comparison is correct, right? So you're just counting how many times these pairs are split from each other. So like I said, it's a bit tedious, but if you do it, it's an easy freebie point for you to get. So now you're going to practice on your own using the rake method for these next few questions. So if you're on student pace mode, you will answer this question on the dichotomous key. You'll answer this question on taxonomic classification, and you'll answer this question on tree frogs and comparing their taxonomic classifications as well. So that would be it. Then you're going to do your exit ticket. Make sure you're either using the cheat sheet to help you with these questions and the exit ticket, or using your own knowledge. I would prefer you try all of these with your own knowledge first, and then if you need to, just to double check, or if you're really bringing up a 0 here and you can't answer the question, then you can use the cheat sheet to help you out.